Hello again guys, and welcome back to another Big L Devlin video here at the House of Devlin. Today is a continuation of our Binding of the Runes, or Forging of the Runes, or whatever you wish to call it. I forgot what I've called the series now. But we're now on to the third rune of the first Ayat, and that is the rune Thurisaz. Okay, sometimes it's otherwise known as the rune of Thorns. And is often associated with Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and sometimes even with the giants, and even less so actually. It has a duality almost to it, the Rune of Thorns, and it has a duality in its effect and function also when used within magic. So it's quite fitting for it to have this duality aspect. Not only is it associated with Thor, but less commonly known, it's also associated with Loki, also the trickster god. It's something that most people don't realise, but it is actually associated with Loki also. So there is Thor and Loki both incorporated within the rune of Thurisaz. It is considered by most practitioners of magic and most pagans to actually possibly be the most powerful of all of the runes that can be used within magic. And this mostly stems from the fact that it represents the will of the universe to get shit done, essentially. If you look at the runes within the cosmological sense, which I've dealt with in other videos, so please check them out in my summary of the Ayats and stuff like this. But in the cosmological sense, when it comes for the universe to fulfilling fate and completing actions and fulfilling probabilities and things like this, gaining oneness as a result, Thurisaz is a representative of the will of the universe to get fate flowing and achieving possibilities and probabilities. So if you imagine the will of the universe, it's going to be incredibly powerful. Now, will, what is will? So we use that word and we all kind of understand what it is. Willpower, so on and so forth, almost like a mental fortitude. But we see something very similar existing earlier on within the first Ayat of the runes, and that is, of course, the rune of Fehu, the first rune of the Ayats. And Fehu is actually representative of desire. And so desire is almost in its essence just another form of will, almost. It's like you will something. It means that you want something done, and so if you want something done, that's a desire, and they are very, very closely linked, Fehu and Thurisaz. Fehu's the very first thing that kind of gets things started, and it is in its own right very powerful, because without Fehu you do not get essentially the separation of oneness, and you don't get fate. You just don't get fate created, essentially. So Fehu is the desire ultimately for probabilities to be fulfilled, and so it causes a separation of probabilities to a chain relativity between them. But Thurisaz is a focused will. So once fate has been almost created, or is being released and is allowed to achieve probabilities and possibilities, Thurisaz is now the focus, or the desire, the focused desire, which is will, which is behind the driving force of fate. Okay, fate is powered by the rune of Aruz, the second rune, but there's, if you've got incredible amounts of power but no sort of no driving force behind it, that power will kind of sit where it is, and Thurisaz almost just gives it that sort of driving force ultimately. And really, the reason why it's called the Rune of Thorns, there are multiple reasons. As I say, really, I like to focus more on the duality aspect of the rune. The Rune of Thorns has a dual edge, it's a two-edged sword, a double-edged sword, essentially, a double entendre, if we want to go down that route. It does polar things sometimes. It can be destructive and it can be incredibly creative in its own right. What changes its effect is the intention behind it, and in fact intention comes after will. actually. And tension comes with on Suze. I'll just make sure I'm pronouncing that correct, because these runes sometimes can get a little bit hard to pronounce correctly. So the next rune is, yeah, on Suze. I was correct. I always double check because I know there's a few that are a bit weird. They're not pronunciated the way they look. So intention, the intention of Suze, changes whether the willpower, the focused desire of the universe, it determines whether it's creative or destructive ultimately. And it's this relationship between all the runes of Fehu and Uruz preceding Thurisaz, but then on Suze following it, and then ultimately Rezu, which is the action of, or the actual process of getting stuff done. It's a fulfillment of probabilities, or the beginning process of fulfilling probabilities that is then swelled further through Canas. But Thurisaz is one of essentially almost like the keystone essentially within it all. You remove this and it all falls apart. It's what connects the first 3 runes with the next 3 runes essentially within the first ayat. It's very, very important. And as I say, it has its duality, not because of the rune itself, but because of the fact that it is dependent upon Suze for it to actually take any effect. It's directly linked into Suze, and Suze, as I say, is intention ultimately, and so intention can be good or bad. And we don't really use those words within paganism, good and bad, good and evil, whatever, and all that. But it can be creative or destructive. But it's another way of using it. You know, different words are just words. But that intention, because it's directly linked into Thurisaz, determines the nature of Thurisaz. It's not Thurisaz itself that has a duality, but it has a duality because of its interaction with Suze, and that interaction is something you just can't get rid of. It exists. Once Thurisaz takes place, you have Suze ultimately immediately after, if anything's going to get completed. Otherwise, you just don't see it occurring, so it's not something to consider. But if something occurs, as I say, whether it's a good, a creative thing or a destructive thing, it's Suze which shapes the Thurisaz, the will ultimately behind the universe or reality. It's essentially like with nature. You could go, oh, nature's cruel, but actually when it destroys something, it's actually nurturing something else at the same time. So there's a duality within nature, and Thurisaz kind of represents that kind of duality. Or again, it's really the intention behind it, or the viewpoint ultimately of the person who's observing the probability fulfillment, whether it determines whether it's seen as being productive or not. And so as a result, as I say, Thurisaz, because it is essentially, as I say, the willpower or the desired focus, or the focused desire of the universe, it is seen as the most powerful of all runes, but the hardest one to use. Now, I personally do not believe that when you use magic there is a price. Old style pagans, traditional pagans like myself, who follow the traditional teachings and the traditional belief systems and so on and so forth, where we haven't been influenced from the modern commercial world, we don't believe that there's a price for magic. When you use magic, you either use it or you don't, and when you use it, there's an effect, but there's no backlash. There's no rebound. There's no, price, as I say, to pay for using the magic. You are simply manipulating a ruse alongside essentially the other runes with whatever form of magic you may be performing, such as Gauda magic or rune magic or Seder magic. You're essentially using the runes, whether you're aware or not, to bring about an effect. But there is no price to pay. Now, modern pagans, pagans who have been influenced by or read spell books, for example, that are sold and so on and so forth, you've got to remember these books have been made to make money. I'm not detracting from the quality of the written texts as such, because there are some good things. I've read them myself. This is not a an opinion of ignorance, so to speak. It's just my personal opinion that I've gained from looking at literature and literary sources, whether it be online or within a book, and I, simply do not accept some of the things that are put into it. Some of it's right, some of it comes directly from source, from the origins of paganism, but other bits are really there because of the corruption of the modern world, and ultimately the sort of impact of growing up. Most pagans are from a Christian country normally, Western Europe, so growing up within a Christian society that has a very twisted view on magic. Okay, Christian societies traditionally, with the idea of witchcraft, burn the heretics, so on and so forth, do not, or suffer not the rich to live, as it is a direct quote from the Bible, do not really accept magic, and they see it as being either something from the devil or something negative, or if it, as I say, if it's at the very least, if it's used, that there is a price to pay. Traditional pagans do not see magic in this way, and so whenever you read about Thurisaz, there's always a reference to when used with an almost impetuous nature, almost when used without thought, in perhaps a desperate situation where you just blart it out and use the magic of Thurisaz. There will be ultimately a price to pay, because you have to tread carefully with Thurisaz. No. That's not true. Thurisaz and the way that you use it, as I say, Thurisaz can be a destructive rune. It can be a destructive element within magic, and it can be creative. And so, if you use it incorrectly, you might end up doing damage rather than harm, rather than actually sort of creating or doing whatever you're trying to do. But that's you. That's not a price to pay. That's just your misuse of the magic. Do you understand the difference? Now, I'm just going to let you see now. Actually, I'm going to read to you a couple of poems, because poems are important within Nordic paganism. So if you're a Nordic pagan, then the sagas and the Eddas and all that, they're all poems essentially. So it's not, and even if you're an Anglo-Saxon pagan, okay, poems were still very important to that denomination of paganism, so to speak. So I'll read you the poems, which give you a little bit of a sort of perspective, more older perspective of the rune. I'm not going to analyse these poems. I'll let you formulate your own viewpoints on it. But then what I'll do is I'll then come back after the video of me, the sped up video of me making the rune. I will then, as I say, we'll come back and talk to you about how it's used in magic, and ultimately why it's used in magic the way it is, and I'm going to tell you the correct way, essentially, as I say, with none of that backlash stuff that is often referenced. It's a problem. Rumours or false knowledge can become actual fact, or but it's not a fact, it's still not true, but it can be seen as a fact when it's propagated from generation to generation, and especially with the internet, false knowledge can be spread very easily and very quickly through the population. So this is my way of trying to dampen down that effect, even though I'm not even claiming to be right myself. There could be a backlash, but I use Thurisaz all the time and I've never had a backlash. So anyway, I'm going to let you watch that video of me making it, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. You can skip that part of the video if you want, no problem, guys. I'll see you soon. Alright guys, so welcome back. Thank you for staying on. Right, so that's the rune that I created, and sorry I forgot to show it in the first part of the video. It's just an oversight at my end. But it's forged within hematite and has been engraved with a Dremel engraver and then painted in to make it more visible. So that's Thurisaz there. Okay. So now that you know what the rune looks like and how I made it look like within the runestone that I have, it's time to talk about Thurisaz within magic as a whole to start off with, and then we can talk about possibly using it within Gouda magic, and then we can kind of look at it within divination. But that's not my strong suit, so to speak, because I use Seder magic for divination, okay, so safe essentially, and things like this. So I don't use the runes for divination, but I can at least tell you what it's supposed to represent and my sort of interpretations of things regards its interpretations and stuff, well, regards its usage and stuff. But first of all, how do we pronounce it? Thurisaz. Okay, that's the old pronunciation for it. Sometimes it's Thurs, as in Thursday, and sometimes it's just simply said as fawn. Okay, Thurs is just Thurs is just the old word for fawn. Okay, so it's heavily associated, as I say, with fawn. And you know what? I do apologise for this, guys. I said I was going to read to you some poems associated with it, so I'm going to read you the poems now. I should have done it before the rune making, but I'll just read them to you now, and then we'll talk about how the rune is used in magic. Okay, well, how it has its effect within magic, I think, is a better way to word it. Okay, so the first poem is an Anglo-Saxon rune poem. Okay. Fawn is very sharp for all warriors, extremely grim and evil to grasp for all men who settle in the mist. And then we have an old Norse or Nordic rune poem. Thurs causes anguish to women, misfortune makes few men cheerful. So pause the video if you want to try and sort of contemplate those poems. It gives you an insight to how the ancient people looked upon, obviously, the rune of thorns, but I'm now going to present to you my understanding of how to use it within magic and why it works within magic and why it is ultimately so powerful. Now, we've already answered why it's so powerful. It is the will of the universe ultimately, and that's what you're trying to almost focus or use, is a proportion of that will. And so it does have incredible power, and the will of the universe, this is one reason why it's named the Rune of Thorns, it's because it penetrates into whatever you're trying to go through, essentially. So it has so much power because, like a thorn, it can easily penetrate through whatever barriers are presented in front of it. And so it very rarely finds anything that kind of slows it down or stops it. It just pile drives through everything. So it's a very hard rune to counter, is in essence why it's considered so powerful. Okay, now I've discussed it a little bit in the first part of the video, but we'll discuss it again, just in case, just rewording it in a different way makes it make more sense, and we'll go in a little bit more detail. Now, Thurisaz can be used, as I say, for destructive things and for creative things. Okay, for example, you can place Thurisaz, etch it, scratch it, whatever, draw it onto something that is sharp. So in the old times, they could have put it on arrowheads, for example. They could have placed it on a knife or a sword or an axe, so on and so forth, with the idea that the Thurisaz rune will allow that weapon to penetrate the enemy's defenses more effectively, make it sharper, and allow it to, more likely to deliver a killing blow as a result. Contrary to that, as I said, there's a duality to the rune, and as I say, that rune duality comes from Thurisaz, which we'll discuss in a minute. But contrary to that, it can also be used for healing. etched into the skin or drawn onto the skin of someone who's perhaps hurt, injured, or ill, it can actually speed up the healing process. So if you are a practitioner of healing magic, the Thurisaz rune can actually be used in such magic. In fact, it is most important to use it in almost all forms of magic, even though it's not actually doing the healing itself, as I'll discuss later. Without it, it's very hard to kind of focus the magic into whatever you're trying to heal and heal it. So you need Thurisaz within healing magic. But as I say, contrary to that, you can also place it on a weapon ultimately, or something along those lines, and make it very destructive. And you can use it as a curse also to kind of almost essentially create a barrier, or sort of and not a nice barrier around you in essence. At least that's the theory. Just dropped something and I have no idea what I've dropped. Was one of my stones. Okay, so there is also a tertiary way in which Thurisaz can be used, and this really links itself most really to its association with 4. This rune is, as I say, heavily associated with 4, much more so than it is with Loki, but it should be equally associated with Loki. Remember, this is a rune of duality, so you have creation, destruction, or the killing of something, to the healing of something, or the creation of something. You have Thor and you have Loki. Thor, the champion of Asgard. Loki, the god who, despite sometimes the best of intentions, does bring about Ragnarok. He brings about the destruction of everything. So you've got a duality there also. Okay, and there's an equal balance between those dualities. So even though most people only really consider its ability or associated with 4, they should also consider it in an equal amount to its association with Loki. However, the understanding of its association with Loki is minimal. I know it's associated with Loki, but the manner in which it's associated, not as certain. I will have to research. I will have to focus on the stones to get more information to share with you on these this aspect, guys. So I do apologise. There's minimal information I can give on that association with regards to Loki at the moment, but hopefully in the future I'll be able to divulge more information to you. But what I can do is, as I say, to talk about the Thor's association. Now, what is Thor quite famous for? Well, he's the god of thunder, but he wields Mjolnir. Okay, which is really what this rune is actually associated to. It's not directly associated to Thor, although there is obviously an association there. It's actually associated more with his hammer. Okay, and so Mjolnir is just the old word for lightning. Okay, and so consequently, because of that association with both Thor and his hammer, it can be used in weather manipulation. Now, it is written in sort of old accounts from normally the Roman perspective, because bear in mind pagans didn't really write things down during that point in time, and we still don't really. But we don't believe in writing down our religious and faith aspects of our faith, and so we always see it from the perspective of an onlooker, but we do see it within the sagas and the Eddas also. So that's the only thing really that pagans ever wrote down, was the sagas and the Eddas, and it isn't like a Bible or anything. It's just the stories, and it's from that we can then sort of get glimpses of the pagan viewpoint as well as the sort of the bystander viewpoint. But it is recorded within history that Thurisaz has been used to manipulate the weather, and manipulate specifically storms. Okay, so it can bring about or strengthen a storm that already exists, or bring about a storm when it's a clear day, if possible, if you're particularly powerful in essence. Now, the manner in which this is done, it is believed that the rune was placed upon the forehead of the individual, so it would normally be drawn on, possibly with woad, if they're, for example, an Anglo-Saxon pagan, but there would be other mediums used, such as blood possibly, or anything along these lines. and the rune would be placed upon the forehead, and that would act as a focal point, essentially for the higher consciousness, to then allow that individual to then manipulate the weather and bring about storms. Now, how quickly or how long it takes to bring about a storm, I suppose it would depend upon whether there is a storm nearby or not. You're not actually creating the storm. This is the important thing when it comes to weather manipulation within pagan magic. You are never actually creating whatever weather that you're bringing, essentially. That's the point. You're bringing the weather. So all you're doing is summoning a storm that already exists to your locale, to your location. So it could be and then then you can kind of enhance and strengthen it ultimately, but you can bring thunder and lightning, but it kind of has to exist somewhere else. You can't just bring it out of existence. Okay, so it's, as I say, manipulation of weather. So it's moving one weather profile somewhere and bringing it from somewhere else, whatever you're trying to bring. So that's the discussion of the weather aspect. I've never seen it done. I've heard of it done. I've heard of it done within ancestors of people I know. I've read about it. I've never tried it. Probably will never try it. Although there's always, never say never, but it is 100% sort of associated with this rune. However, I imagine you have to be quite it's not about being powerful as such, because it's not your power that makes the magic. All you're doing is tapping into a ruse, and a ruse is the power behind all the magic that you use. So it's not like an inner power from you, but you must be very much connected with the divine aspect of the spiritual realms, and your knowledge of magic and sort of innate willpower to manipulate magic must be very strong to be able to bring this about, I imagine. And not everyone can do it. You have to be. This is definitely one of those abilities that you have to be born with, because it is being tested within clans, and this goes down the knowledge and history and the memory of clans. It's passed down verbally from generation to generation, that even though it is present within the clan, the ability to manipulate weather, there's no guarantee that your son or your daughter will inherit that ability from you, but it will only pass it on along your bloodline. So really, yes, there are certain bloodlines that allow you to use magic, but there is still no guarantee that you will inherit it. It must be like a recessive gene, I suppose, if you're looking at the genetics of it. But that ability to use that magic, as I say, is very much exclusive to hereditary aspects. Okay. However, Thurisaz can be used in other ways, as I say. It can be used within runesmithing and manipulation of the runes, and this is actually an aspect of shamanism, actually, more than anything else, because what you're doing is when you etch the rune into, as I say, like an arrowhead, for example, or a dagger or something along these lines. You can etch it into anything you want, obviously, but we're looking at the sort of the old ways in which the magic used to be used. You would put Thurisaz into the metal, and the rune itself would do absolutely nothing to the metal. Drawing that rune, just like I did into the hematite, does absolutely nothing to change the sharpness, sort of the penetrative ability of that. Thurisaz by itself actually has no real power at all, the actual rune, the actual shape of the rune. However, it does have one power, one sort of very innate, very strong ability, and that is that it can be used as a focus for your magic and acts as a sort of conduit between yourself and the eventual final sort of endpoint that you're trying to get to. Now, how do we know this? Okay, well, first of all, when you put the rune of Thurisaz upon either a knife or an arrowhead, or upon someone's skin who you're trying to heal, it may be yourself, for example, or upon your forehead when you're trying to manipulate weather. Again, it all depends, okay, what you're trying to do. You always, whenever you're working with Thurisaz, always have to inscribe it onto whatever you're trying to work with normally, apart from within, of course, Gouda magic, but that's something different. But when you're trying to work with it to bring about different, almost very abstract magical effects, you have to inscribe it onto whatever you're focusing on, because, as I say, it acts as a catalyst. It acts as a focus for the magic that you put into it, and it's your... And we'll go from the beginning before I go into it now. Okay, so first of all, you must progress along the runes. This is the best way to understand the magic that you use if you're able to use it. You must, with Thurisaz, very much logically progress through the runes of the first 6 ayats, essentially. Okay? Well, not 6 ayats, sorry, the first 6 runes of the first ayat. Okay? So first of all, you require Feihu. Well, that's the desire for the magic. Okay? You bring that desire. You have that desire to use the magic. So if you're a shaman, okay, and are able to use shamanism, you bring the desire immediately just by etching the rune onto the object or the person. Okay? And then you have the desire to go further with that etching. You then, as a shaman, as I've discussed in other rune magic videos, use a ruse, which is magic. Magic is a ruse, a refined version of a ruse. A ruse is the power of the universe to achieve anything. It's the sort of the battery pack, essentially, at the very beginning of everything that fuels fate and allows fate to achieve everything that it achieves until the end of time. Okay, without a ruse, nothing gets done, and so a ruse is magic. And I've gone over that sort of analysis before in far greater detail and explained how that is so. But if you haven't seen those videos, or you don't want to go back and go and find them and watch them or whatever, just simply accept that what I'm saying here is a ruse is essentially the web of weird, which is what shamans and other magic practitioners tap into. Okay, when they use magic, we do not have any real power. We have, our ability is the ability to use the web of weird, to tap into it, to use our higher consciousness, to use it for a particular intention that we give it. Okay, but the power to create that magic, that's already there. Okay, and it's in the form of a ruse. And so when we come along as a magic practitioner, we have the desire to use magic. We tap into the web of weird and we bring the power of a ruse, thus fulfilling the second rune by simply using the magic. We then have Thurisaz, which we have inscribed or etched into or drawn onto whatever object we're trying to work with. And Thurisaz, as I say, is a catalyst rune. Okay, that's why it's so important, because you cannot use the will of the universe. You cannot manipulate the will of the universe. You can simply just direct it into whatever you're trying to use and use that as a focus point for your magic. You can't manipulate the will of the universe. It will do what it wants to do. Fate is fate. Destiny especially is destiny. You cannot manipulate it. You can manipulate fate, but that's for Seder folk only, and it's very hard to do, and it's something you don't do lightly. Okay, but Thurisaz is a way of using the will of the universe, not to manipulate fate or anything like that really as such, but just you're using the rune as a focus point for your magic, and you're just directing the will of the universe temporarily into that rune. So instead of having to try to use your own willpower to use or to fuel the spell, or to ultimately try to manipulate the willpower of the universe, which is never going to happen, you simply inscribe it onto what you're doing. And as I say, that's why it's so important to inscribe it, because that is your focus point, that's your catalyst, and that's how Thurisaz is always used apart from in Gouda magic, and that is to inscribe it onto something. Okay, the rune itself has no power. It simply diverts the power that you need into itself temporarily when you focus upon it, when you give it Feihu and you give it a ruse. But then you must use that willpower that is then brought into the rune along with Aruz and Fehu, you must give it intention, or specifically direction. Intention and direction are the same things, and this is represented by Ansuz, which is that one there. Okay, Ansuz. Okay, and Ansuz is, as I say, intention or direction. If you look at the cosmological aspect of the runes, and once you give something direction that has will, power, and desire, you then finally can progress onto movement, or, as I say, the conversion of intention into application, into achievement of a fulfillment, or the beginning of fulfilling an action, essentially. And that is Reizu. Okay, Reizu, which is looks like an R. There we go. Okay, Reizu. Reizu is the rune which is represented by a wagon, actually, traditionally, or simply just movement, and that's exactly what it is. It moves. Okay, Reizu is the movement or the fulfillment of a probability, or, well, the beginning of the fulfillment of a probability or possibility, and that is what your intention is, moving everything else that you've put into that rune. You put into the rune, as I say, intention, will, the ruse, or the strength of the, essentially, the universe, essentially, or the web of weird. You put into the rune magic, essentially. Thurisaz is then focused with the rune itself, and then you give it intention, which is, do you want this thing to hurt, or do you want it to heal, essentially? That's why it has a duality for us. It depends on what you want to get out of it, and once you've given it an intention, i.e. what you want to get out of it, do you want to harm, or do you want to create or maintain, then you then finally get an action out of the magic, out of the rune, and that magic is fulfilled ultimately then with Canas. Canas, which is that one even. Canas is that it then swells that power that you've put into it to finally lead to a Gabo, essentially, and then ultimately Wunjo. Okay, but that's another thing. Essentially, really, the only point that we kind of have to get to is Reizu, which is then a sort of, it's a non-stop thing. Once you've started to fulfill an action, providing there's enough power, which there is, because you're using a ruse as the power, the rubber weird, then ultimately you don't have to worry about Canas and that kind of looks after itself. But it's the Reizu, which is the beginning, the fulfilling an action that we want. And so if you have malign intentions behind you, and you put, and it could be for self-defense, it could be, it's not necessarily a bad thing making a weapon more dangerous, but obviously it really normally only has one specific purpose, and that's to take the life of another. So it is in some ways a bad thing, right? In many ways, if not always. Okay, but if you were to put the rune of Thurisaz upon a weapon, a dagger, an arrow or whatever, and someone was to steal that weapon or to use it, and you didn't want them to use it, then that rune would do nothing to that weapon. But if you then give that weapon to someone, or use it yourself, and as they're using it, you focus on that rune and you put into it all those things I've said, Fehu, Aruz, the Thurisaz is already there, and then you give it intention with Ansuz, then you'll get the action that you desired, which is a weapon that will penetrate more deeply, or cut more deeply, possibly penetrate armor like chainmail and that, like back in the old days. And so that is how it will be used. But on the flip side of the coin, the healing aspect, because as I say, the duality of it all is created by your intention. So if your intention is to maintain or create rather than to destroy, so if you look at the cycle of life within paganism, it's creation and destruction. So if you look at the creative aspect rather than the destructive aspect, your intention is to heal, or to speed up, or to strengthen the healing process. And so when you place the rune onto someone and focus upon it, on them healing, then that rune will take that intention, that onsus of, you know, maintaining their healing process and strengthening it as where possible. Then you can actually speed up or strengthen the healing process of the individual that you put it upon. Okay, now that is the theory behind a Thurisaz, and how the rune Thurisaz can be used within magic. Now the final, well, there is divination, and normally it means a warning. Okay, so it's normally representative of a warning within divination, and I'll also have a look else. Well, it's a warning either against acting in anger yourself or against the anger of others. So it's a warning about anger, essentially. Is indicative of watching out for a difficult situation. It is also sometimes a warning that someone is harboring anger towards you, that they are likely to act upon at some point. And it can also be a warning against you using to try and avoid impulsive actions that might cause you problems. Okay, so really that is what it's supposed to mean in divination. But then within Gauda magic, and this is how I mostly use the runes, Gauda magic, Thurisaz is very useful, and it's very useful when combined with a ruse. Okay, so as you guys may know, if you've watched my channel, I'm very much into my weightlifting and sports and stuff like this, and martial arts and stuff. But when I'm doing more specifically my weightlifting, if I'm going for a PB or I'm going for something that's particularly destructive on my body, then what I do is I use a ruse. A ruse is the rune of strength, so that helps give you strength, and it really does fill you with strength. But it also fills you with courage in some ways also, because of course it's not just strength of body, but strength of mind, strength of spirit, or strength of consciousness ultimately that a ruse can lend strength to. But then if I will alternate in my mantras, so to speak, before going on to my lifts, I will go ooze, Thurisaz, ooze, Thurisaz. And what happens is that Thurisaz becomes combined with a ruse ultimately. And the Thurisaz gives, as I say, that sort of penetrative aspect. Again, it allows you to go through barriers ultimately. In this case, it can strengthen your own will. Okay, so you can strengthen your body and maybe your mind, as I say, or your heart or whatever, if you're looking at courage. You can strengthen yourself with a ruse, but then you can give yourself a strength beyond your capabilities with Thurisaz combined with it. Thurisaz allows you to go through your barriers, your own barriers, that are your limitations, your potential ultimately. You can go beyond your potential by using Thurisaz. And so when normally you would no longer be able to continue, Thurisaz keeps you going through that barrier and allows you to expand your potential, expand your limits beyond where they would normally go. Now it can only take you so far, but it will take you through your barriers nonetheless when used correctly. And so Gauda magic can be used in such ways to allow you to go through your own personal barriers, and I find that's the nicest way to use Thurisaz. Thurisaz can also be used as a protective rune, okay, and when within Gauda. And when incantated, it's supposed to, when you direct another individual in this case, so you're not directing it towards yourself, you're directing it at someone who seeks to do you harm essentially. You direct, so it's a protective rune that doesn't like form like a barrier around you as such, but it's a protective rune that actually goes out towards your opposer ultimately, and you can use it Thurisaz and direct it at another individual, and it essentially can break their willpower ultimately. It can make them think twice about coming and attacking you. It's protective, and the closer they get, or the more aggressive they get, the more impetuous they become, Thurisaz gets stronger. Okay, just like a ring of thorns around you. If they want to walk into the thorns, that's when it almost can do harm, essentially, because essentially what you're doing is it's the will of the universe, i.e. the beginning ultimately of the force, because you put intention behind it also. It's just automatically sort of given on Suze. You ultimately are using Thurisaz to bring about Reizu, actually, and it's the Reizu. So Thurisaz molding the Reizu, but it's the Reizu, the force that then goes outwards, which is an action or a force, as I say. Reizu can be a force as well as an action, or the beginning of fulfillment of action. And you can give an outward force ultimately, as I say, that gets stronger, more destructive and harmful the more that the person opposes against it. Really, the only way to get against, and in some ways, it is also described as being a rune that can be used in curses, because obviously, if you put it out there as a negative energy, you give it a negative ansuz associated with it, you can use it as a long distance curse ultimately if you focus upon a particular individual, send it out, and it will have harmful, forceful effects upon that person in essence. Now this is where most people then would quote, well, you know, if you do this, be careful of a sort of a splashback ultimately, or if the further the person is from you, say they're on the other side of the build. So for me in Australia, if I was focusing on someone in Australia, I was to throw the rune out there, so to speak, then ultimately that rune ain't ever going to get to that person, but it's going to come back and hit me. But it doesn't do that. It doesn't harm you, doesn't hurt you, unless you use it potentially impulsively, and then it doesn't hurt you. It just, when you use it impulsively out of desperation, let's say, you know, you were surrounded by people, you're suddenly ambushed by a load of muggers, and you use it without thought, then it can have a negative effect ultimately, because you can use it with the wrong intention. That's the only real payback it can give, is that, you know, at the moment, at point in time, all you want to do is to protect yourself, is to hurt someone else. It goes and hurts someone ultimately, but then you regret it ultimately, because then you didn't want to hurt them. That's ultimately the payback, but it's not payback, it's just you not using the rune properly, because the rune can also represent, within, when you look at the rune itself, patience. And the reason it can be patience is, how do you get through a thorn bush without hurting yourself? With patience. You do not go through a thorn bush quickly. You must progress through it carefully and with due attention. And so really the way to overcome Thurisaz is to simply approach, you know, if it's used upon yourself, approach calmly, and you will bypass its defenses ultimately, because Thurisaz is a defense using attack. Okay, attack is its best form of defense. Okay, just in the same way that a thorn is, but its attack relies on you being the aggressor, or, you know, whoever it's directed at being the aggressor. And if they're not aggressive with it, then, you know, it has minimal use at that point. And so really that's the other side really of Thurisaz, and how to kind of get through it. So it is a powerful rune, but it's quite easily countered, but it's a great way to slow progression of aggression down, essentially, in that sense. So it is a rune, but it's a rune that I hope you never have to use, other than it's obviously very useful for healing. So, you know, if you ever get hurt, then I obviously hope that, you know, you can use it to help yourself, but I'm sorry that you've been hurt to start off with. So as I say, it's a rune that I hope you've never used, because it's either one, it's destructive, or two, it can heal, but sorry that you have to heal, you know. So it's a rune that I hope you never have to use, but that's a discussion on the rune nonetheless. I hope you found this useful, and the next rune that we will consider is on Suze, which of course we've touched upon today already, but that's enough for Thurisaz. Thank you very much. Bye bye.